Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Tonight we are joined by Sam Rowlands, member of the Senedd for North Wales since 2021, Shadow Minister for Local Government and Welsh Conservative Policy Director. Hello Sam, how are you?
Good afternoon, Matt. Very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, Sam. But thanks for coming and speaking to us today. I'm going to start off with a sort of biographical question. What got you first involved in politics, Sam, and what made you pick the Conservatives?
Well, of course, choosing the Conservatives is an easy one. Why wouldn't you choose the Conservatives, Matt? Absolutely. But why I got involved in the first place was just in my town in Abergele for North Wales. Pretty young once. I think Cameron said that once to me as well. And I was 21 years old actually, and I decided to run for a council election in my local ward, and somehow managed to get enough votes to win. That was all the way back in 2008, and just happened to have my local member of the assembly, as it was then, Darren Miller, encouraged me to stand, and thought I could do a half decent job. 2008 on the county borough council and town council, and then re-elected 2012, 2017. And then made my way down to the Senedd in 2021. And I guess from a Conservative point of view, answering your question perhaps a little bit more seriously, I guess it's around having personal responsibility. It's probably the thing that settles most with me. You will know the Conservative Party is a pretty broad church. I generally wander around the centre ground of the Conservative Party. I tend to fall to the right more naturally, but I have made decisions when I was leading my council, for example, and when I was the cabinet member for finance, that weren't particularly conservative, like raising council tax at 5% and beyond that as well. So fairly pragmatic conservative, I would say.
You talk about your local authority and obviously the leader of Conwy Council. How would you describe the differences between being a leader of an authority with a multi-million-pound budget and then becoming a backbench MS? Do you find that change in power dynamics slightly weird?
Definitely different. And it sounds really obvious, but the big difference is it's just a lot more political. Being down in the Senedd than local authority level. And I think the way that Conwy Council in particular was set up, there's never been a party majority there. There's always been coalitions in place of one form or another, and usually those coalitions are in place with a group of independents. Now, I think a Conservative Party or a Labour Party is a broad church, then a group of independents is beyond broad. So you're having to sort of manoeuvre perhaps some of the decisions you're making with those groups of independents, which is an interesting challenge. But then, as a leader of a council, you're right, really powerful position. And perhaps not many people appreciate what leaders of local authorities can and could do. It became very apparent during the pandemic, so that was a fascinating time. So I was, leading a council during the pandemic and the peak times of the pandemic. And I think governments at all sorts of levels, whether UK or Welsh governments, suddenly realised they don't actually do that much doing. It's actually councils, health boards, that level actually does the doing that affects people's lives on a day-to-day. Of course, government sets the agenda and a policy objective, but in terms of delivering on the ground, which we needed desperately during COVID, it was organisations like councils who did so much of that work. So I had a slightly unusual view of life of a council leader because of the amount that I had to get involved in during that COVID time.
Before we move on to the Senedd, we're going to stay in local government a little bit. But as a shadow minister for local government and the former leader, you probably have a strong opinion on every Welsh political geek's favourite question of local government reform. Has that ever been anything you've found compelling, the argument for reducing the number of local authorities in Wales, or do you think, like you talk about that local delivery, do you think that localism is really the value of local government, not what us anoraks think about making it a bit neater?
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky balance to get right, isn't it? Between the sort of what can be seen as an efficiency of larger local authorities versus not losing that touch in terms of that local connection with people. And there's some great examples and some really bad examples on both sides of that. So the example I can point to for my patch in North Wales is the reorganisation of the health board. It used to be in 3, merged into 1 as Betsi Cadwaladr. Don't think performed well since that's happened as one large organisation. Some people point to that change as the catalyst for the performance, really going downhill. I'd be in favour, and I think it's a sensible place. Is there local authorities who voluntarily want to consider coming together? I would have thought any sensible government would want to see how that could work. I had that experience when I was in Conway myself. I think we were in opposition at the time, actually, formally as a party then, and we proposed to merge with Denbighshire, and we were willing to do that. I think it was actually Alan Davis, our favourite former minister, who was the minister at the time, and we kind of called his bluff a little bit, because we said, well, we'll merge then if that's something you're wanting us to do. It never happened, as you can tell now, but. It's an interesting idea. If 2 local authorities or 3 local authorities look at each other and say, well, we probably could or should work better as one, I think that is the ultimate, surely, in local democracy, in allowing them to do so. So that's probably where I sit these days, yeah.
So when you obviously talk about being elected to the Senedd, you were elected on the North Wales regional list by, I think in the end, it was something like 21 votes over the nearest Plaid Cymru candidate. What was that experience like, being on a regional list and not really knowing whether you get elected or not? And did you feel like you were going to get elected, or was it that thing that's coming right to the last minute?
Well, first of all, it's fantastic to be a Plaid candidate. Always a pleasure to do that. So that was the overwhelming feeling, let's be honest. But no, I honestly wasn't expecting to get elected on the day, because when you look at the arithmetic, what usually happens when a party gains a seat at a constituency level, you either maintain or you lose a seat on the regional level, because the way the maths works on the D'Hondt system. So when I saw on the day of the election that we'd won Vale of Clwyd, which was previously Labour, I thought I wasn't going to get elected on that day. And as we've just alluded to, I was leading the council. And I remember sitting down with my chief executive and talking about perhaps how the future may look in the council. And then lo and behold, that night, my agent, who was at the count, gave me a phone call and said, I think you might have been elected here, Sam, because I wasn't even at the count, because I thought it wasn't going to happen. And and then about 20 minutes later, he rang me and said, yeah, you've just been elected. So it was a bit of a surprise, and I remember ringing my wife. It was early hours of the morning, and she was fast asleep still, so I didn't actually get to tell her till the morning that I'd been elected into the Senedd. And of course, she was very pleased that her husband was away from home 4 days a week in Cardiff, I'm sure.
I'm sure. So obviously, one of the roles you've taken on since coming down to the Senedd is policy director of the Welsh Conservatives. We've talked to a couple of your Welsh Conservative colleagues in the past about what it means to be a Welsh Conservative, and how it sits, how comfortably it sits being both a Welsh and UK Conservative, and how you sort of have to bridge those gaps when there's policy differences. Do you still think there's value in trying to create sort of a delineation between the Welsh and UK Conservative brands, and how difficult is that sometimes when there are policy disagreements?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting line of question, actually. I think it's something I personally sometimes grapple with, being really honest with you, getting that balance between a UK party, which we are, and the vast majority of people, I guess, see that as the case, whilst having a Welsh lens over things, because I'm born and bred in Wales. I'm proud to be from my part of the world, and I've never actually moved out of Wales. And so I had instinctive defence of what it means to be Welsh and how it feels here sometimes, without removing myself from the fact that we're part of one of the greatest union of countries in the world, I would say. And we have to keep that really strong as well. So on the policy director role, I've been in this post for a few months now. good time just to review what was in our manifesto in 2021 versus what we may want to consider in a future manifesto. What's really interesting, part of what you opened with actually, Matt, was just we're actually in a very different time now compared to 2021 for all sorts of reasons, but predominantly because everything was viewed through the lens of COVID leading up to the last election. So reading the manifestos, I'm sure all listeners do this from time to time when they're struggling to sleep, is actually the manifestos from 2021 are so different to most manifestos. And actually, there's probably a fair bit in there that we need to consider how relevant it all still is. And there's one final point on this as well. I think part of your question is one worth chewing over, probably not to be answered today. As Welsh Conservatives, do we see ourselves as Welsh and Conservative in equal balance, or is it Welsh first then Conservative, or is it Conservative first then Welsh? A bit of a philosophical point, I guess. Like a lot of philosophical things, doesn't necessarily have an answer. But I guess that's the thing that we should continue to work through.
Again, it's an interesting thing. We have got a general election coming up, and don't worry, that's going to get covered at points during this conversation. But in terms of creating, liaising with your UK Conservative colleagues, what extent are the Welsh Conservatives inputting on devolved areas or constitutional areas with the UK party?
So there's discussions. I link up with the team in number 10, the policy team there, and they have specific devolved policy team in number 10 as well. It's worth remembering that we have not just a Secretary of State for Wales sat around the cabinet table. We have the PPS, the Prime Minister, with the constituency here in Wales under Craig Williams, the Chief Whip, which is probably, if you're Prime Minister, is probably the most important person to have alongside you, especially these days, it seems, is also from a constituency here in Wales. So it's not as though those making the biggest decisions aren't surrounded by people who would probably have a decent amount of influence on perhaps where the decisions are being made.
So speaking of Welsh Conservatives in Westminster, I mean, former Welsh Conservative leader Lord Bourne made some comments recently saying that he no longer recognises his party. What was your assessment of those statements? And do you think that the party has changed? And do you think that's been done dramatically? Or do you think it's just a natural evolution of our political era? Like you said, things have changed drastically in the last few years since COVID. I think our entire political discourse has. Do you think this is just part of that broader change?
I think there was a significant change in the way things were presented and debated, I guess. I feel like under Rishi Sunak, things have been brought more central in terms of the way you'd expect a Prime Minister to lead a country. I think, if I remember rightly, what Lord Bourne was referring to wasn't the current leadership of the Conservative Party, but perhaps some excitement about others who have led or been involved in leading the party in the past. So I think where we are today, I'm really comfortable with. As I say, at the start of this, I've been involved one way or another, elected anyway, at least for 15 years. Okay, as a councillor, not a huge level. And throughout 15 years, I always been completely happy with where we were as a party? Absolutely not. And nobody is in any party, if they're being completely honest, through a long period of time. So I think, as I say, there's a strength in having a broad church as a party. I think it's even bigger strength when we have a Prime Minister who's bringing us fairly centrally and leading us in a way that Prime Minister should lead us.
So let's talk about the Prime Minister. Obviously, he set out his agenda at the recent Conservative conference. What do you make of that agenda? Obviously, you're going to be very positive, but what aspects of it do you think are going to benefit Wales? And what do you think the chances are for the Welsh Conservatives in the UK and Wales when we do hit that general election this time?
There's no bones about it. It's going to be a tough election next year. no matter how positive I will be about my party. It's going to be a tough election next year. Prime Minister set out his 5 priorities earlier on in the year and reiterated those at the conference. Also pressed home the point about long-term decision making, which I think is important. You mentioned earlier about perhaps a generation or a culture of politics that seems to have happened in recent times, but there's definitely, in my view, been a short-termism to politics generally. I guess it's the advent of 24-hour news cycles and social media probably hasn't helped that short-termism, because you're expected to have a decision for everything straight away. But no, so in terms of Wales, the big headlines are still things that affect most people. It's the inflation. Prime Minister set himself what some people see a challenging target of halving inflation by the end of the year. That is, if we're honest, that's probably the biggest thing that's affecting most people's lives at the moment, because the thing that eats away our pay packets all the time. Seeking to grow the economy, we're still the fastest growing economy, despite how sluggish it feels and has been. We're the fastest growing economy in G7, still faster than France and Germany, and Italy and Japan. And people who try to deride where the UK is, we're Western democracies have been struggling with their economies for a number of years now. So I guess it's trying to remind people, no matter what is being said, that there's some good news out there, that inflation is come down pretty dramatically. The economy is growing, and those things are probably the 2 things that affect most people in Wales the most.
Well, one of the largest announcements at the conference a couple of weeks ago was obviously the cancellation of the northern leg of HS2. Well, one of the very
was that sorry, did that happen to him, Matt?
I don't know. I've not been paying.
I can't remember that being a thing during the conference at all.
But obviously, that was one area where there had been some level of policy disagreement between the UK and Welsh Conservatives in the fact that you did think that Wales, in some way or another, was owed Barnett consequentials out of HS2. Do you think that the cancellation of that northern leg makes that argument even stronger? And again, although I acknowledge that the Welsh Conservative policy was never to give the money straight to Welsh government, do you think that we do need now to see more UK government investment in Welsh transport infrastructure as a consequence?
Yeah. Joking aside, the HS2 series of announcements over recent weeks was an interesting way to come to a conclusion. I guess it was interesting during the conference. It was probably the thing I was asked most during any interviews was what's happened with HS2. But as you said, as Welsh Conservatives, we've consistently said right from the very beginning that actually there should be Barnett consequentials, as you acknowledged. I think it does make the case even stronger that those consequentials should come through. Of course, on the other hand, we are seeing a commitment to around £1 billion into North Wales in my patch, which I'm very, very pleased to hear the Prime Minister say. Is that enough? I'd be always welcome to see UK government investing more money into Wales to improve our public transport networks. We've seen, I think, last week, TfW, Transport for Wales, having the poorest customer satisfaction of all rail networks in the UK. We do need investment here. Welsh government probably need a helping hand.
It seems like, again, a weird question. It's a question you always find journalists asking politicians and party members of how well their respective political conferences, and everyone was speaking very, very positively about the Labour Party conference in terms of its atmosphere. I've been to Conservative Party conferences in the past that have had a good buzz. Was there an air of optimism about this recent Conservative Party conference, Sam, or was there a feeling that there was still quite a lot of work to be done in terms of conveying the Conservative message to people?
I came away from, I sound like I'm a proper toe in the party line here, honestly, but I genuinely came away feeling much more positive than I expected. And it was just good to be together in a room, bringing up some of the issues we were talking about so far. it was more positive than I expected. I can understand we're a party now has been in power for 13 years, but what we do have is now a prime minister who has a very clear plan, which is something we can all get around and support. It's been a tough few years. Let's not try to say anything other than that. It has been a real tough few years. COVID was a difficult time for any party in government, but I've been really impressed that the Prime Minister has a clear plan for the next few years ahead. And I think people in the Conservative Party are really behind that.
So there was a by-election in Scotland recently, and I don't think anyone was expecting the Conservatives to win that one, But there has been some good news for Scottish Conservatives, with former SNP MP defecting to the Scottish Conservatives, and she claimed that the independence campaigns had become divisive. What is obviously you're a proud unionist, but what is your assessment of the strengths of the various independence campaigns? Do you think that we have sort of almost gone past that being sort of the issue in places like Scotland? We could argue it's never been the issue in Wales, but you could certainly say there's been a growing strength and feeling towards those campaigns. Do you think we've almost gone past that point, back to a sort of more people being more comfortable in the union?
So the SNP point, first of all, I mean, I'm not sure what words to use to describe what's happened up there, but they've had absolute disaster and all of their own making, which is an interesting lesson for any political party, I guess. If you create something bad of your own making, then you're in real trouble. At least with external forces, you can have some defence against it. When it's your own lot, then you're pretty stuffed, aren't you? And the independence debate in Scotland, it's been pretty toxic for quite a long time. And I suspect it's been difficult for people in that part of the world to bring in nuanced debate and to have some sensible discussion, because it becomes all very much either completely out, rather than having a sensible discussion about what might be better for the future. So huge sympathy for anyone getting caught up in that. And it sounds like to me in SNP in particular as well, there's just been some real bad culture in there. And we have seen some real bad reports come through from culture in Plaid Cymru in recent times. I'm not linking the two together at all, and the different issues there. But again, for any political party trying to deal with culture internally, it's important to start with quickly and properly. Independence in Wales, there's certainly a vocal group of people. I get some wonderful messages from them on social media telling me how much they like me. I should probably not bother reading them, half of them. And going back to that toxic point, it's interesting on social media, actually, the worst, the nastiest, the most vile stuff, it doesn't come from people on the left of politics. It comes from people on the nationalist or as in the opposite to the unionist campaign, and that's the telling point. I think when people are going so low in terms of the language and the level of debate, to me that doesn't seem like grown-up way of dealing with what's important to people in front of us. Are we beyond independence debate in Wales? I guess there'll always be people who want to have those discussions, but it would be really helpful if people have those discussions in a sensible way that isn't vile and looking to create more division.
The challenge that's been levelled at unionists in Wales for a couple of years is that there's been almost a failure to make a positive case for the union. But obviously, speaking to you and other Conservative colleagues, you see lots of benefits from the union. Of course you do. But do you think that there's perhaps been a failure on not your part particularly, but on the part of the unionist campaigns to make that positive case as often or as strongly as you could have otherwise?
Perhaps. Personally, I haven't heard that level of criticism that you're describing. The clearest, most obvious thing we should be talking about is the economic benefit of being together. I think part of the issue is when we talk about the economy, it sounds like a thing that's out there somewhere doing something that nobody really kind of grasps hold of, but it's absolutely fundamental to everything that we do and see and are in terms of how we live our lives, and then how public services can respond off the back of all that. So that's probably the bit that we're probably not doing well enough, is describing the importance of a strong economy that businesses can flourish in, so that people can support their families, and then we can receive the great public services. At the moment, I'll make this point again, because you wouldn't expect nothing less from a Conservative. For every pound spent in England, Wales receives £1.20 in Barnet consequentials to fund those services that we desperately need. And the economy, London and the South East is currently, supporting the UK as a whole massively. Without that booming economy, it would be a sticky situation in Wales.
So you are the representative, one of the 4 representatives for North Wales. How have you found the challenge of representing such a vast area, from Ynys Môn to in rural areas to much more urban areas in the northeast? How do you sort of find that balance?
It can be really tricky sometimes. I've counted it, first of all, a massive privilege, though, because I was born in Bangor, I brought up in Penygroes to the side of Carnarvon, on sort of the furthest west of my region at the moment, actually now. And now my office and my family, we live in Abergele, right in the middle of North Wales. So I just love the fact that I'm able to represent a part of the world I was born, brought up, educated, worked from, bringing my own family up in now. There's nothing better than that, surely. But in terms of the challenge of the geography, that's one thing, of course, just practically getting across the patch. You're talking 2 hours from one side to the other. And then it's an interesting phasing of culture, culture across North Wales, from the border with England, right on the east there, Wrexham, Flintshire, and then in the middle, Conwy, Denbighshire. It's kind of a mix of all worlds, and then to the west of Gwynedd and Anglesey, it's certainly much more Welsh language centric culture. And that's more of the challenge, I guess, is understanding how to do my job as an elected member across that span of culture and expectation.
I imagine one of the major things filling up your post bag pretty much every day, and you've alluded to it already, is Betsi Cadwaladr. It's a major challenge facing North Wales. And again, you talked about the issues with reform previously, but do you think that all of these problems and challenges can be faced by simply reforming the health board? Do you think it's simply changing chief execs or changing those who are in charge of the health board? How do you untangle this very complicated web that's been formed with all the many problems facing the health board, Sam?
I think that's a really helpful description, first of all. It's a tangled web, and there's not really one lever to be pulled that's going to sort things out. It's never going to be absolute perfection, because we have human beings running things, and sadly, as humans, we don't always get everything right. But it could and should be a whole lot better than it is today. I think there's a few issues to think about. There's been a culture of dishonesty is incorrect, but it's certainly not always been transparent with the truth. It's probably the nicest way I can put it. There's been a fear of reporting up when there's been lessons to be learned and concerns in parts of the health board. So that's meant the board who are making decisions, those people around that table, have not been given the information accurately to make the right decisions for the residents that I represent. Culture is one of the hardest things to change, but there's an old adage which says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can put all the strategies you want in place and make all the personnel change. If you don't change culture, then nothing's going to change in there. And I think, to be fair, those points have been taken on board by the current interim chief exec and chairman. I think the part of the challenge at the moment is that there's a vicious cycle in place, because it's a failed health board, not failing, it's failed health board. It's hard to attract really good people into those positions, because who wants to work in a failed health board in special measures for years and years and years? So then trying to attract good people is difficult. So perhaps you have people who aren't as good, and is that going to improve things? It's hard to make that change when it's hard to attract those people. And so that's the first thing, I guess, about culture is the thing that needs to shift. But there are some practices as well that really could make a difference. There's a huge reliance on agency staff, on locum staff, and that goes back to personal responsibility. So when you're employed somewhere and you're seeing those patients today, but you're also going to see them tomorrow, you will make sure that the service that you are receiving is much better than if you're just in for one day and you're never going to see those patients ever again. So there's some practical points that need solving there. And probably the third point within all of that is actually around the training, which Welsh Government are looking to address with a medical school up in Bangor, for example. What's happened for years is that people reach a certain level in their training and have to come down to Cardiff and got a young family or something. You don't really want to keep relocated up and down. So there's some practical changes that are happening there as well. But all in all, it's just a real sad situation for the residents that I represent. And for the staff, there's 19,000 members of staff in Betsi Cadwaladr. It's the largest employer in North Wales. And it must be really demoralising at times for those staff who are there day in, day out. I got to declare an interest. Sorry, my sister is a nurse in Betsi, put on the record. And a fantastic nurse, of course. But I would expect it may be difficult for those on the front line, like nurses, but not just nurses and doctors, but the admin teams and everyone else who's involved. So it's trying to break that cycle is what needs to happen there.
I mean, obviously the news that we've seen, that A&E waiting times have been misreported, and hundreds if not thousands of hours have gone missing essentially from the amount of times that people have been waiting. What is your assessment of that news, and how does this sort of thing happen? Is it just a simple clerical error, or is it that fear of reporting and accountability, perhaps?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly why that's happened, but one thing I do know is that in my short time in the Senedd so far, there's almost been a disbelief when Senedd members like myself have stood up in the chamber and explained to the minister what we're seeing, what my residents are coming to me about. It's almost dismissed as, oh, it must be a one-off, or you're not seeing the bigger picture. And I hate to say I told you so, but these examples exactly paints a picture that we're seeing on the ground and raised with the minister directly in the chamber. And it's time. I've been here 2 years, but talking to colleagues who've been here longer, they see it come to their inbox. Right? Mental health was an example leading up to special measures in 2015. They saw an inbox time and time again, issues coming through. Said, warn the minister, there's a problem here, and they'll get dismissed until a formal report comes out and says there's a problem. And what I think there's there is a problem, I think, in Welsh government culture of not listening respectfully when concerns are raised. I'm not talking about 20 miles per hour just yet, I know. But there's another example there where there seems to be genuine concerns from people and just those concerns being dismissed. And that culture within health has been prevalent for quite a while, it seems, when members of Senedd who have been elected in their own right, receiving that information from patients and residents, constituents, raising with ministers, there's like a suspicion, or it must be a political conspiracy that you're saying these things when we're wanting to get what's right for our residents. So sorry, on the question about the A&E numbers, honestly, I don't know what the underlying issue has been there, but the truth that's come out today reflects what we've been saying and seeing on the ground. So to me, it's no surprise. It actually makes more sense today because it's actually what we've been saying for a long time. I've had personal experience of myself, for example, in A&E for 13 hours without being seen overnight. And there's just some systematic issues, I think, that need to get sorted out.
I mean, going back into something you said there, Sam, about the way the Welsh government listen. I mean, obviously you're the chair of the CPG for tourism, so this is a well-rehearsed argument for you. But because there was a huge Welsh government consultation relating to the tourism tax that essentially the Welsh government was saying, well, we've listened, or we've reached out to people, but we're not necessarily going to listen. Do you think that is sort of just synonymous with how the Welsh government conduct their consultation exercises or their listening exercises? They're sort of doing it because they have to, rather than because they're in any way genuinely interested about what the people of Wales have got to say. Yeah, and we might get into 20 mile an hour afterwards on there when we talk about that case.
Yeah, I think it's a the way I see it is sometimes it can feel very arrogant. And Conservatives, we get accused at times of a right to rule attitude. But in Wales, it does feel like Labour have that attitude of a right to rule. And they've been in power for nearly 25 years in this place. So you could argue there's a reason why they developed the attitude of a right to rule. It's not healthy for democracy. It's really not healthy in terms of the relationship that government has with the third sector and other and public bodies as well, because you very rarely hear criticism from the third sector or public bodies about the Welsh government, because they've been in that position of power for so long. Even if privately behind the scenes there is criticism, there's probably a fear at times of openly criticising government that they rely on for their future funding. It's not healthy. It's not good, and we see evidence of that arrogance coming through on things like consultations. The other place I saw on tourism actually was the change to 182 days for sorry for a technical issue. This apologies, but
you're talking to the right crowd of people here.
the way in which a definition of a second home is given, whereas the sector were more than happy to move from where they were originally at 70 nights of overnight stays. They were more than happy to move up to something around 105 days. I think it's like 97% of the consultees opposed the 182 nights that Welsh government wanted, but Welsh government, okay, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. We're going to do it anyway. I don't think it's good.
But again, this goes back to obviously being a member for North Wales, probably the region I think that got the most signatures on that very well publicised 20 mile an hour petition. It does seem strange, that petition with nearly it ended up with nearly 500,000 signatures. It was definitely by a long way the most signed petition in the history of the Senedd. But I mean, what's your experience on the ground talking to other members of the Senedd, whether those kind of conversations you're having with members and ministers in the corridor? Do you get the impression that there is an appreciation that this is deeply unpopular, or do you think the Welsh government might do something about it, or do you think they're just going to, drive on regardless? Is probably a bad pun for the situation, but I think you get what I mean.
Drive on slowly, regardless. I think is the point, isn't it? I get the impression that nothing will change from a Welsh government point of view. They've got their position, they hold on to position. They may look to be seen to be tweaking things here and there. Fundamentally, they think they're right, and they may be right on a bunch of things with it. But clearly, the way it's been communicated and the way it's landed with people, people feel aggrieved, and they've tried to figure out what's the best way of expressing that frustration. It's via a petitions system that we have in place. And you're right on the volume. It's really, really significant. But in terms of Welsh government acceptance of that, it's been dismissed for all sorts of reasons. And the minister in particular, his approach is, he literally say these words: they will learn to like this. They will get this in the end. And it's pretty condescending stuff, considering as politicians, we're the ones who've been elected by the people to be here. Now, what I found really interesting about the 20 miles per hour stuff is actually it's woken people up to the fact that decisions are made in this Senedd that affects people's lives day to day. There's far too many people, sadly, who don't understand or even have a view as to what the Senedd does. At least 20 miles per hour stuff has raised awareness in people that it makes decisions that can be pretty significant from time to time.
This is, again, I think I think the public's awareness of the Senedd and the Welsh Parliament grew massively during COVID because it had a direct impact on people's lives and how they lived their lives. And now again with 20 mile an hour, but there did seem to be a dip in the middle where public attention of what was going on in Cardiff Bay sort of dipped away from a bit. And I think it's a very interesting question, isn't it? How do we improve engagement with Welsh democracy unless it's just, not saying either way, but in these sort of massive life-changing policies, how do we get people more engaged when it's not something as massively newsworthy as 20 mile an hour or a once in a lifetime pandemic?
Yeah, I think we as political parties have a responsibility here as well, in making sure that we get a message out to our party members and constituents generally, as well. Obviously, between Labour, Liberals, and Conservatives, there is a huge attention on UK elections, and understandably so. And time and energy goes into those is massive. So I guess there's a responsibility on us to get a message out to people. But it can put a connection between put my X in a box and what difference that really makes. That's one of my concerns, genuine concerns, not just playing politics here. One of my genuine concerns about reform of this place is that it's more difficult to make the connection between putting your X in a box on a proportional representation basis. It's harder to see that connection between the person you're electing. So for me as a regional member, I think it's quite difficult for a lot of people in my region to know how they affect whether I'm voted in or not as a Conservative regional member. I think if we're really honest about it, most people would not have a clue. Whereas at least for all the problems of first past the post, there's a direct connection. There's that accountability, that connection between putting your X in a box and making the change in the place that makes decisions. So it's one of my genuine worries about, Senedd reform around the corner.
You spent a large amount of time in the last 12 months or so working on your proposed outdoor education bill.
Yes.
For those who don't know, would you be able to sort of explain the aims of that legislation and sort of outline some of the support and opposition you've faced to it?
Of course, it's been nothing but support. It's such a good bill.
Oh no, of course, yeah.
But the bill itself is basically seeking to ensure that every child at some point in their schooling in Wales gets the opportunity to go away for 4 nights of residential outdoor education. So for people in my part of the world, it's going to a place like Glanflyn or other sort of outdoor residential places, and usually happens in year 6, end of primary, going to secondary, but doesn't have to happen then. Basically, what's become apparent that it's either become very expensive for people to have this trip. So my daughter is currently actually away at the moment on her trip. My middle daughter, who is, how old is she? 9 years old. And sorry, her birthday last week. I had to catch up. So she's 9 years old, and that's £240 for 2 nights. So it's not a small amount of money for my daughter to go along to that, and for many people that becomes unaffordable very quickly. So this basically seeks for government to put to consider it alongside the curriculum. I think it's such an important part of a child's experience to have that time with the classmates, have those outdoor adventurous experiences where there's a bit of risk, there's a bit of can we do it so safely at times where there's lots of evidence that shows actually it's not necessarily great for children growing up in terms of building resilience. So the bill will seek to guarantee the opportunity. It's not forcing children to go on that. It's presenting the opportunity, and that'll be a paid for opportunity for all children in Wales. And the outcomes you'd want to see is certainly lots of evidence to show as long-term physical health benefits, long-term mental health benefits, because people suddenly engage with the outdoors and more confident in accessing the outdoors. And some great evidence around connection to the environment, to talk about climate change and appreciating the great spaces we have. Actually builds that understanding of the impact of climate change on our environment. So I think that's about the summarize I can give it. Been working on it for over a year now, as you say. The draft bill will be laid in a parliament at the end of November, so not too far away now.
Wonderful. So I mean, the only sort of opposition that most backbenchers ever face to their bills of this kind is from the Welsh government themselves. And do you think that's because they have any opposition to the policy itself, or is that just, again, Welsh government backing, failing to back any bill that isn't their idea?
Yeah, I think so. So formally, when the government minister, Sir Jeremy Miles, spoke to the bill last October, he was very supportive of the principle and liked the idea and talked about the benefits of outdoor education. Gets it all. It will require funding, and that was his concern. I guess it remains his concern because Welsh government have a deficit in their budget at the moment, so they're trying to find things not to fund, let alone things to fund in the future. But there is a good point actually around how government views members' bills. It goes back to this perhaps arrogance that can be seen at times of we know best, you don't. I think if I recall rightly, forgive me if I'm wrong here, I think only 2 members' bills have ever got through the Senedd. And the first was Anne Jones's sprinklers, so part of the government party at the time. And then was it Kirsty Williams's
paid staffing? Yeah,
paid staffing, minimum staffing on nurses on ward, isn't it? So I think nearly 25 years of some sort of a parliament or assembly in place. Only 2 members' bills going through. It's not great for democracy. I don't think that. I would prefer an approach which is much more coming alongside, understanding how they can't be fully supported, what like the idea and want to try and develop the idea. But I guess Labour government have been able to govern for that long and held a tight grip of things for a reason.
Sam, thank you for coming on. I've got a couple more questions before you go. So before you worked in politics, you were a risk manager. What would you perceive as the big risks and opportunities facing Wales in the next 12 months?
Yeah, so I was a risk manager for a bank, credit risk in particular. So that was fun for about 10 years. But on risks facing Welsh politics, did you say? Sorry,
or Wales. What do you think?
Wales, yeah, crikey. The risk facing Wales. Biggest risk, actually, I think, is going back to this point around the economy. As I say, not being taken seriously. And I think there's an interesting thought here, perhaps not to be explored today. But I'm trying to figure out why it's not on the agenda properly for Welsh government. I think it's because there's no direct consequence to Welsh government's funding if the economy does really well or the economy does really badly in Wales, because they'll still get the same Barnett consequential from UK Treasury. So anybody listening has a great solution for that. I'll be interested, without devolving the Treasury, of course. But there's got to be an incentive to Welsh government, perhaps, to drive the economy. Because at the moment, like with our favourite friend, the 20 miles per hour thing, is in their own numbers going to impact the productivity of Wales. But to Welsh government, does that really matter to a certain extent? Because I still receive the same consequentials anyway.
So me and you, Sam, have talked in the past about our shared loves, which are guitars and country music. Yes. With that last question in mind, if you had to describe the prospects of Wales and the UK in the next 12 months with a song, which one would you pick?
It was a country song. I think there's a song I've heard in the last week or so, which I think is called "Hold My Beer." So I think that would sum things up at the political roller coaster we might face over the next 12 or 14 months.
Sam Rowlands, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on.
Cheers, Matt.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.